I think that we don't spend enough time asking the audience to speak. So one of the things, much like you, I've been giving speeches for about 10 years now. And the typical situation is I'm hired at some conference. It's like 3,000 to 5,000 people, right? And I'm basically the entertainment. Like they want some smart entertainment. And with this book,
you got to have a couple of jokes. You got to land it.
Here's an interesting story that makes you think. But with this speech, because it's about communication, I've been doing a lot more. There's actually an exercise that we do where you turn to the person next to them and you have a conversation with them for 5 minutes. And the entire audience will do this. We've done this with like 10,000 people in an audience. It's really, and the question you ask and answer is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? So they're really good conversations. But what I do afterwards is I say, okay, look, you just had this experience. Tell me what it was like. Like, don't tell me the content. Is anyone in this room willing to tell me like kind of what that was like? And 30 or 50 hands go up. And we might spend 10 or 15 minutes having people describe the experience they just had. And afterwards, people will tell you that was their favorite part of the speech. They don't like listening to me. They like listening to the guy sitting next to them or the woman sitting next to them. They like someone saying, here's an experience I had, because they say, I've had that experience, right? I think that as a public speaker, we tend to think of ourselves as an oracle, as a fountain of knowledge. Mm-hmm. What we really are is we're a master of ceremonies. And the ceremony, the act, is all the other people in the room.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, if you're brand new here, subscribe, because you're going to get leaders like Charles Duhigg and Jim Collins and Malcolm Gladwell and Nona Jones and a whole lot of others if you subscribe. Hey, today we do have Charles Duhigg, and we're going to talk about being a super communicator. So maybe you've read his book, Supercommunicators. It's really about connecting with people, but Charles and I talk to those of you who are on a stage on a regular basis. You know, if you're preaching, if you're a public communicator, how do you take his research and apply it to our craft? Plus, we're going to cover a lot more. Hey, today's episode is brought to you by my Art of Leadership Academy. Did you know that we've got live coaching calls inside the Academy every single month? And this month, you will get a chance to connect live with Patrick Lencioni. So to join in on it and to see a list of the upcoming calls and speakers, click on the link of the description of this episode wherever you're watching, or visit theartofleadershipacademy.com. And if you get in right now, you can join Pat and me for the August coaching call. You'll be there live. You can ask Pat your questions live. Patrick Lencioni this month in the Academy. Don't miss it. And today's episode is brought to you by Glue. In less than 10 minutes, you can set up simple automations that welcome new visitors, build your prayer culture, and do a whole lot more. And you do it by text. So simply go to glue.us/free texting to create a free texting account and learn more. And now my conversation with Charles Duhigg. Well, Charles, it's great to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you so much. This is really a pleasure.
Yeah, so you can go in a lot of different directions. And I want to get into why you wrote the book, but it seems to be culturally, we're in a moment where maybe we're doing this. We're not really understanding each other particularly well anymore. I've noticed even like the death of conversation. I'm not talking to you, I'm talking at you. What have you noticed in terms of some trends in communication as you got ready?
It's interesting because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication, because in the last decade, because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we now know more about what happens inside our brain when we're talking to someone than ever before. But at the same time, you're exactly right. We are living through this period of polarization. And part of it is that, when your and I parents went to middle school and high school, they took a class called home economics or interpersonal relationships or something like that. Church, I know that many of the listeners are church leaders. Church membership used to be a given. And you would go to church. Yeah. And one of the wonderful things about church is you would be sitting down next to someone whom he lives in a different neighborhood, maybe votes for a different party, does a different kind of job, maybe different socioeconomic. And the only thing you really have in common is that you're both in the same congregation together. Mm-hmm. And so we had a lot of education about communication. We had a lot of opportunities to practice communication. And communication was seen as something that is really important to America and to the world. Now, since then, by the time you and I were in middle school and high school, that had fallen out of curriculums, right? Which is fine because it was sort of replaced by more technical topics. And we now live in a world where you could still be a member of a church and never sit in that congregation again, right? You can do it all sort of by Zoom. We don't belong to Rotary clubs and to Oddfellows clubs the way that we used to. And so as a result, not only have we stopped learning how to communicate, we've also lost some opportunities to practice it. And as a result, because we've fallen out of practice, we're just rusty at it. But the truth of the matter is, and this is the good news, is it's not hard to get better at it. It's just a set of skills. And once you recognize those skills, they're really easy to practice.
Do you think, this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and we can move on, into some other subjects, but I do feel like we're talking past each other more in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, right? So a couple of things. Number one, in a smaller non-online world, which I have a memory of, you sort of have the people around you. And like you say, you're forced to interact with them. Now I can interact with whoever I choose. I can find people who agree with me, but I'm also used to posting updates. So This is what everything from, stereotypically, this is what I had for lunch to here's what I think about X. And I've noticed that a lot of communication, and in Supercommunicators, you really go in a very different direction than what I'm going to suggest now, is I give a status update, then you give a status update that isn't related to what I just said. Is that actually a trend in communication, or am I just in the wrong circles? What have you seen?
I think it is. And I think in addition to that status update, that it's crossed, that the other thing that happens that's similar to that is a feeling that if somebody says something that I disagree with or that isn't true of me, that I need to witness my own experience, right? I need to, that simply listening to you and understanding you, if you're saying things that I might not agree with, is not enough, that I need to voice my differences. And I think that this gets at what is the goal of conversation, right? Because the goal of an online update is very different from the goal of conversation. When you and I talk to each other in a conversation, my goal should not be to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. My goal should not be to share my experience entirely with you if it's not interesting to you. My goal should not be to convince you that you ought to like me or that I'm smart. The goal of a conversation is simply to understand the other person and to speak in such a way that they understand you. And let's think back to those church experiences, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have people who sit down together and they believe in a common faith, but they have many other things in difference. If you and I vote for different parties and we have a conversation and I understand kind of why you support your guy and you understand why I support my guy, and we both walk away still voting for different parties and thinking that like the other person, that there's something about that the other person believes in that doesn't sit exactly with me, right? That conversation is still a huge success. The goal of a conversation is not to agree with each other. The goal of conversation is not even to find out things you have in common. The goal of a conversation is to understand how this person sees the world and speak in such a way that they understand how I see the world. And if you do that, all the other stuff ends up happening, right? We inevitably do find something that we have in common. We do find things that we agree on. We might disagree with each other on politics or race or religion or X or Y or Z or who ought to win the World Series. But the fact that we have had this experience of connecting with each other feels really good. It feels redemptive. And so those differences become less important. And that's, I think, what's missing from a lot of the conversation right now.
The backstory to Supercommunicators was a little bit personal for you, right? Was it a little bit of a selfish project? Not selfish,
absolutely.
But like
all
self-exploratory. Okay.
Yeah, all of my books are selfish projects. They all start with me trying to figure out how to improve something about myself. So I fell into this bad pattern with my wife, which is, and I think this is probably familiar to anyone who's listening who's in a relationship. I would come home from work after a long day and I would start complaining about my day and, my boss is a jerk and my coworkers don't appreciate me. And my wife very reasonably would offer some like good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying to me, I would get even more upset. And I would say like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. You're supposed to be outraged on my behalf. She would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And this happened frequently enough. I mean, this happens in every relationship, right? Where you have what seems like a benign conversation and goes off the rails. And so I went to these researchers and I asked them what's going on here. And they said, well, here's one of the big things that we've discovered in the last decade. We tend to think when we're having a discussion that we're talking about one thing, right? We're talking about our day, or we're talking about where to go on vacation next year. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And in general, those conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're solving problems, where we're making plans. But then there's also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society. And they said, what we've discovered is if you are having different conversations at the same moment, it is very, very hard for you to connect with each other, which is exactly what was happening with me and my wife, right? I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. They're both legitimate conversations, but because they were different kinds of conversations, we couldn't connect. And so one of the big takeaways for me from this has been when you spend time just asking yourself, what kind of conversation is happening here? And then match the other person and invite them to match you. What's known within psychology is the matching principle, that for successful communication, you must be having the same kind of conversation at the same time. When you match each other, you make it much more likely that you're going to find a way to connect. Even again, if you don't agree with each other, even if you have different priorities, it's that connection that's really essential.
My wife and I were talking about that. We recently did a marriage retreat for young couples, like basically our kids' age. Yeah, in their late 20s, early 30s. It was amazing. We're at this ranch in Montana. It was incredible. And we talked about just that there are times where she comes home or I come home, and you're right, it's often over dinner. And Tony is her name. My wife would say, I'd be complaining about something and she'd give me advice. And I'd be like, no, that's not helpful. And we did that until we realized, you're looking for empathy, not advice. You're looking for a sounding board, or someone to say, I'm sorry you had a bad day. I hope it gets better. How do you reframe that conversation? Like how did you and your wife, for example, work through that? Did you
and it's
name
worth
it?
Noting it's not just at home, right? This happens at work too, right? You give someone some like constructive criticism, and you see this as a practical conversation. I want to help you get better at your job. But they are very much having an emotional. They're feeling defensive, they're feeling under attack, they're feeling anxious. And if you don't recognize these different kinds of conversations, you're at a real disadvantage. So the first question, when it's very easy, when it's me and my wife, when I come home now and I start complaining about work, Liz will just ask me, like, she'll say something like, do you want me to help you come up with solutions to this? Or do you just need to get this off your chest and just kind of vent for a little while? And I, of course, say like, I just need to vent. This isn't that big a deal. Like, I just want to complain for a couple of minutes. So you can oftentimes just say, what kind of conversation are you having? Now, when it's at work, when it's a little bit more sensitive, when we're in a conflict situation, that's harder. And in those moments, the best thing that we can do is we can ask a question. And in fact, there's a special kind of question known as a deep question that's really, really powerful. A deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating to ask, but it's actually very straightforward and easy. It's as simple as like, if you meet someone and you say, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a doctor. The next natural question is, where do you practice medicine? But if instead you were to ask a deep question and ask something like, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right. When I do that, what I'm doing is I'm inviting you to tell me who you are. And you're going to tell me some important stuff. You're going to tell me some stuff about what you care about. You're going to tell me some stuff about how you make choices. You're probably going to give me a little bit of biography about you. And you're also going to tell me what kind of mindset you're in. Because the same person in one setting might say, I wanted a job that was a steady job, and there's always going to be a need for doctors. So that's someone who's in a practical mindset right now, right? Mm-hmm. But that same person might say, actually, my dad got sick when I was a kid, and I watched these doctors heal him, and I wanted to be one of those healers. That person's in a much more emotional mindset. So the key is to ask a question, and this is particularly powerful when we're in a conflict. There's this phrase I love, if you're feeling furious, get curious. Because what it reminds us is, in those moments when we are feeling heated and when we are feeling worked up, and we just want to make the argument, we want to force them to see things from our perspective. We want to convince them that we're right. If instead we ask a question, it's going to be much more effective at bringing us together.
So when I picked up the book, when I first saw it released, I thought, I'll give you this misconception just to see whether it's connected. I thought Supercommunicators. So I'm a public speaker. I give talks at conferences. I've been a preacher for years. A lot of the audience is in similar space here. I thought, oh, you're going to tell me how to give a great public talk. What it's really about is human connection. What it's really and what it's really about is you and me having conversations one-on-one. But I'm curious, how much, like if you follow what, and this is an application question, if you follow what we're about to talk about, does any of that translate to becoming a better public speaker?
I think it does, but if you see that public speaking opportunity as a chance to have a conversation. Now, there are times when I get up on a stage and you get up on a stage and someone gets in a pulpit, and our goal is not necessarily to have a conversation. Our goal is to share an idea with others. Right? To say, look, I learned this important thing. Here's the part of the Bible we read this week. I want to reflect on what scholars have said about it. And that's really powerful. But it becomes even more powerful when it becomes a conversation. And what happens in a conversation, what's distinguishing about a conversation is that there is a back and forth. Now, sometimes that back and forth can be verbal, right? Sometimes I can say, who in the audience has had this experience? And some people raise their hand and I say, tell me about it. Tell me what happened. And we actually go back and forth. Sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes the crowd is too big. It's just not the right setting. But we can still have that conversation if we are anticipating what the person is saying to themselves, right? When I bring up this idea and I say, now I just made an argument and the objection that is probably in your head is this. Let me tell you what I think about that.
Wow.
Then I'm drawing you into the conversation. I'm actually having a conversation with you. Now you got to be pretty good at, you got to be humble enough to say what's actually happening inside that person's head as opposed to what do I hope is happening inside their head. Because what I hope is happening inside their head is they're saying, oh my God, this preacher is the best person I've ever seen speak on a stage. I buy everything that they're saying. But the humble truth is, you're probably disagreeing with me. And you're probably saying, I'm not sure why you're on that stage and I'm not on that stage. And when I engage with that, I can have a conversation with you and the same principles all still apply.
So this is interesting. I love to drill down with you. There was a preacher a generation or two ago named David Buttrick, and he had a phrase called a contrapuntal. And it's exactly what you just said, which is I'm going to present a view. It could be whatever. It could be a theological point of view. It could be a whatever. And you find the objective that you think is going to be in the audience's head and you address it out loud. Now, some of you may be thinking, I can't believe in anything invisible. Or some of you might be thinking, I can buy that Jesus was a good teacher. Rose from the dead. Are you kidding me? Or, you're probably thinking the rules don't apply to you when it comes to burnout. Well, what if they do, right? So is it some of that? Is it
absolutely a part of it? That's absolutely a part of it. Is that trying to put yourself in your audience's shoes, trying to put yourself in their place, trying to ask yourself, if I was listening to someone give this speech, what's the conversation that would be happening inside my own head, right? Because nobody agrees 100% with the person who's on the stage. But I think also part of it is proving that we're listening. So I mentioned the importance of asking deep questions. That this is a really important part of being a super communicator. In addition, it's really important that we show that we're listening to the other person, particularly when we're in a conflict. And there's a technique for this known as looping for understanding that's really, really powerful. And they teach it at a bunch of schools. And it has these 3 steps. The first step is you ask a question, preferably a deep question. The second step is after the person has answered the question, you repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. And the key here is not to mimic them. It's to prove to them you're paying attention, and more importantly, that you're processing, that you're thinking about what they said. And then the third step, and this is the one we always forget, is ask if you got it right. Because one of 2 things will happen. First of all, they might say like, no, you didn't get it right. You didn't understand me, which is useful. Or the second thing is they say, I think you got it right. You understood what I was trying to say. And what we've actually done in that moment is I've asked you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. and you've acknowledged it. And when you acknowledge that I'm listening to you, you become more likely to listen to me. So how does this work for the person on the stage giving that speech?
Yeah.
When we say, some of you are probably thinking, there's no way Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah. There's actually a step deeper we can go to say, some of you are probably thinking Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And what you're also thinking is, you're thinking, look, if I believe in this one magic story, what's to stop me from believing in all the other crazy magic stories that are out there? Why? See, so in that case, I am proving not only that I am listening to you, that I'm trying to see this from your perspective. I'm proving you that not only am I hearing the objection that's happening inside your head, I'm thinking about the objection inside your head. I'm processing it. And when I do that, that's when I'm on your side.
Wow, that is a great example. And that's exactly what some of my favorite communicators do, is they sort of raise the objection and then they go underneath. And then another thing, because you talk about this in your book extensively, it's really getting to know the other person, right? Yeah. It's that whole idea of trying to be understood rather than trying to understand. And I'll give you an example. I did a speaking tour earlier this year of Australia and New Zealand, and I gave the same talks in 6 cities. And it was great. We had a lot of leaders there. And then the evaluations came in. One of the talks was personal. It was about burnout and a system that I use. I wrote about it in my last book, At Your Best, on how to manage your time, energy, and priorities. The other was on church models and trends. And one of the organizers was very excited about the second talk. He's like, Carey's bringing this brand new material to Australia, et cetera. We got the evaluations back. 90 to 95% of the comments were about the first talk. And I think the difference was, it was about an issue, which was still personal, trying to grow a church, but it was so personal. And I've listened to thousands of people and their time management problems and their burnout issues and their struggles. And I was able to parrot back to them some of the very real situations they were facing. So I'm thinking, and then I want to get into some of the principles, but I'm thinking in terms of, public speakers and communicators. The technical term is you exegete the text. So if you're going to preach on the Bible, you do your exegesis, your deep study of the text and its original context. But they also say you have to exegete the audience. You've got to study the audience. So do you have any thoughts or tips on studying your audience and giving them feedback on what they might be thinking? I thought the resurrection example was great, but can you drill down on that a bit more?
Part of it is, I think, being in those audiences. Like, let me ask, when you are preparing that first speech and you're thinking to yourself, what do I want to tell this audience? What do I think is going to resonate with them? Who's the person that's in your head? Like, who are you writing that speech for?
Well, a lot of the examples came from the former me in my 30s when I was running around at 90 miles an hour with my hair on fire. The other was the 35-year-old pastor who I've met 1,000 times, leading a church. It's growing. They're working 5, 6, 7 days a week. They don't have time for their family. They've got a couple of young kids. Their marriage is okay, but it's not great. And there's just constant pressure and constant tension. And they can't close the laptop because there's always some urgent fire. I was speaking to that person.
So what I hear you saying, and tell me if you think I'm getting this right, is you had a person in your head, and it was you or it was a composite of folks you talked to who you knew some of what they would say back to you. Like, you could actually have a conversation with that person. So you were performing the exegesis on the audience before the audience was even there, by essentially imagining who your audience is and putting yourself in their shoes, which part of it is you were in their shoes, right? You were that 30-year-old. You have been that 35-year-old who can't close the computer. So you're almost having a conversation with previous versions of yourself. Yeah. Now that's what we do before the speech. When we're in the room, and if you notice, politicians do this really well. They listen to the crowd. So let's use Donald Trump as an example. Whether you like Donald Trump or you don't like Donald Trump, if you ever go to a Trump rally, one of the things you'll notice is he will say something, and if the crowd roars in approval, if they give him some feedback, he just leans into that topic. He just he'll start riffing, right? Ad-libbing about whatever he just talked about. And part of what he's doing is he's showing that crowd, I am listening to you, right? All those other politicians, they're on some script. They're just going to say whatever comes next on the teleprompter. But me, I'm listening to you. If you like something, and this gets him in trouble, right? Because that's how he ends up saying some crazy things. But I think a really good public speaker is someone, and that doesn't mean you're a good person or a good president, but a good public speaker is someone who not only is listening to that crowd, they're showing them that they're listening to them.
Wow. That is a really good point. And so what would that look like? I mean, you've given keynotes before. Does that mean when you see something, I always ask for the house lights to be up. Not super bright, so it feels like you're in a cafeteria, but just so I can see people.
Yeah.
And what would be some of the things you would do if you see a point is landing? I was talking about AI relationships and the fact that a lot of guys are going to end up having AI porn in the future. And the look of discomfort on the women's faces was, oh my gosh, it was horrendous and amazing at the same time, just to watch the shock and the disgust sort of wave over a congregation as I described what's coming down the pipe. And it's one of those things where you can feel it, you can sense it. So what do you do in a moment like that?
So I think in a moment like that, and this runs counter, when we think about ourselves as public speakers, what we think about ourselves is always knowing the right thing to say, right? Always having the next sentence on the tip of our tongue. In a moment like that, I think the best thing you can do is just pause for a second and say, as I'm looking out at the crowd, I'm seeing some of you really uncomfortable with this idea. And let's just take a minute to sort of acknowledge that this is something that makes people, makes some of you pretty uncomfortable. Similarly, oftentimes, as you know, one of the feedback cues that we get is laughter.
Yes.
And people are much more comfortable laughing than they are shouting or something else like that, right? So we tend to hear laughter much more than we do other forms of emotional expression. But whenever a crowd laughs, I kind of take a second and just let myself A, enjoy the laughter, but B, say look, is there, whatever made them laugh, is there something that I can lean into a little bit there? I'm sure you've had this too, when you have slides and you look out and you notice that a third of the crowd has their phone up and they're taking a picture of the screen.
Yes.
Right? There's something
100%.
on that screen. There's something on that screen that's capturing them. Oftentimes what I do is I just kind of pause for a moment and I say, I notice a number of you are interested in the screen. Let's talk about this. Let's drill down a little bit more into what's interesting about this list or this image. And part of it is, when we are good public speakers, we want to be practiced and we want to be polished. And taking ad-libbing is not as practiced and polished as the speech that we've given 30 times already. But what we lose in the practice and the polish, we make up for in the relationship with the audience. Because what we're saying to the audience is, it's not just that it's Tuesday, so I'm on a stage at 7:00. It's that I am in this room with you. When you tell me something through your laughter, through your expressions, through what you're doing, I am listening to it and I'm reacting to it. That's when it becomes a conversation.
That's a very important point because, as I hear you talk about that, first of all, it resonates. Secondly, it's exactly what you do in a personal conversation, right? You're not like, oh, I wanted to get to my next slide, so let's just keep going. You never do that. Right. You're like, oh, you like that team too? And next thing you know, 30 minutes has gone by and you've talked all about, the Super Bowl or whatever you're talking about or some hobby that you have in common. Everything else derails because you found a common connection point. Now, I'm not saying yeah, go ahead.
And by the way, the best conversations you have, if we did write them down, if you got a transcript of them, they would look like messes. Right? It's people interrupting each other. I just interrupted you, right? Right? What we're saying, we're not saying them in the most eloquent, perfect way possible. But what makes a good conversation is not how polished and beautiful it looks afterwards. It's the experience of being in it. And so whether you're on a stage or whether you're talking to someone face to face, no one remembers what you said to them in a conversation, but they definitely remember how you made them feel. And so it's worth focusing on that. how do I make you feel welcome and at home and part of this conversation rather than just an audience absorbing what I'm saying?
So I can't wait. I'm taking a break from public speaking for a few months just to rest up and work on some other things. But I can't wait to get back there because here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to prepare less content, which is always a challenge. I'm going to read the room, which I think I do a decent job of. But I mean, if it's a 3 to 5 minute excursus on a particular topic or just drilling down, I'm going to leave the space to be able to do it and to slow down. Any other tips for public speakers that you could glean from your research and work?
So I think that we don't spend enough time asking the audience to speak. So one of the things, much like you, I've been giving speeches for about 10 years now. And the typical situation is I'm hired at some conference. It's like 3,000 to 5,000 people, right? And I'm basically the entertainment. Like they want some smart entertainment. And with this book,
you got to have a couple of jokes. You got to land
exactly.
it.
Here's an interesting story that makes you think. But with this speech, because it's about communication, I've been doing a lot more. There's actually an exercise that we do where you turn to the person next to them and you have a conversation with them for 5 minutes. And the entire audience will do this. We've done this with like 10,000 people in an audience. It's really, and the question you ask and answer is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? So they're really good conversations. But what I do afterwards is I say, okay, look, you just had this experience. Tell me what it was like. Like, don't tell me the content. Is anyone in this room willing to tell me like kind of what that was like? And 30 or 50 hands go up. And we might spend 10 or 15 minutes having people describe the experience they just had. And afterwards, people will tell you that was their favorite part of the speech. They don't like listening to me. They like listening to the guy sitting next to them or the woman sitting next to them. They like someone saying, here's an experience I had, because they say, I've had that experience, right? I think that as a public speaker, we tend to think of ourselves as an oracle, as a fountain of knowledge. Mm-hmm. What we really are is we're a master of ceremonies. And the ceremony, the act, is all the other people in the room. And so how can we facilitate them saying something that surprises themselves? How can we facilitate them hearing something from someone they know who's sitting across the room that surprises them? That's the thing that they walk away remembering. And if we see ourselves as this host, as this master of ceremonies, it empowers us to do this. And I have to say, we've done it in huge crowds. And every time I bring it up, someone's like, ugh, I don't know, man. This is is someone going to want to say something revealing in front of 10,000 people? And it's worked every single time.
Fascinating. And I would just say, if you've done it with 10,000 people, there's not a person listening to this podcast who has a room bigger than that. I'm pretty safe to say, most of them have 500 to 1,000, maybe 2,000. And that would be interesting. Is there a difference? Because you often come with family and friends to a church, whereas at a conference, if you're doing an event, you tend to be seated next to a stranger, or do you think it doesn't matter?
I think that one of the things that we can do that's really powerful in a church is we can say, switch chairs with the person with your brother next to you so that you're each talking to a stranger. But even if you're talking to your brother, think about that question. When's the last time you cried in front of another person? If one of my family members answers that question, that's still going to be a powerful conversation.
Yeah, you're going to go deeper. You're going to go deeper that day.
I don't know the last time my wife cried in front of another person. And frankly, if she told me and it was something that I knew about, hearing her talk about that experience from her perspective would still be really valuable.
Yeah. Where are the losers in that? It's a great question. Yeah. I don't think there are any losers. And you don't have to do it every time if you're up there 50 times a year. But to do that once in a while, are there other ways to involve the audience or elicit feedback that you can think of that would be helpful or make it more of a dialogue?
So there's actually this thing called the Fast Friends procedure. That's these 32 questions. People might have heard of them, the 32 questions that lead to love. So if people just Google the Fast Friends procedure, the questions will come up, or they can just come to my website and I've got a copy of them there. So those are really great questions. So you don't want to do the same question 50 times, but there are 50 great questions that you could do it with. But let's say you don't want to do that. Let's say it starts to feel like a gimmick. You don't want to. I think the other thing that you can do is so what happens in a conversation? And not everything has to be a conversation. Sometimes I get up on the stage, I just have something I want to share with you, and you want to be entertained. And I shouldn't demand of you to have a conversation, because sometimes we get in the Uber and we don't want to talk to the driver. We want to check our email. No one should ever have to have a conversation when they don't want to. But let's say you're saying, this week, I do want to have a conversation. I don't want to ask the when did you cry question. What is a conversation? A conversation is an opportunity for someone else to talk about how they see the world and then to react to it. And so maybe I'm not having you turn to the person next to you. Maybe I'm having someone from the audience come up and talk about their own experience. Maybe I'm having an onstage dialogue with me and someone whom I've said, hey, look, you got a week to prepare. I want you to challenge everything that I'm saying. But we're thinking about that back and forth as a two-way street as opposed to a one-way street. And as everyone who's listening knows, it is so much more fun to watch two people tussle with each other or disagree with each other or agree with each other or contribute to each other. That is so much more fun than just hearing one person talk about that. And so the more that we invite that, the more that we make that feel like, the other thing that happens is you have to think about the proxy for the audience. So if you're not having the audience talk to each other, but you are bringing someone from the audience up, even if you've told them, I'm going to bring you up mid-sermon, right? All of a sudden, that person stepping onto the stage is a proxy for the audience. So they're identifying. So that person brings up a good argument. It's as if I brought up that argument. And I'm now participating in that conversation because my proxy, my representative is up on the stage with you having the discussion.
It's a really interesting paradigm that honestly I don't see a lot of preachers or conference speakers doing. Something really good to wrestle with. So I want to get into some of the brain science because you've got a lot of it. So there's this phenomena that you identify as synchronization. Can you explain that and some of the other things that are happening in a good conversation from a brain science perspective?
Absolutely. So there's this concept of neural synchrony. Whenever we're in a conversation, something happens. Our bodies will start to match each other. So even in this conversation, even though we're not aware of it, and we're separated by thousands of miles, our breathing patterns are becoming similar. Our heart rates are actually becoming similar. Depending on sort of the lighting situation, our pupils might be dilating at the same rate. Now, we're not aware of that, right? We don't pay any attention. We don't know that's happening. But what's interesting is that at the same time, our neural activity is becoming more and more similar. And that actually kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if I describe to you an emotion I felt, the reason it's powerful is because you experience that emotion a little bit, right? Or if I tell you about an idea that I had, the reason you can understand it is because you kind of experience that idea a little bit. So it would make sense that what's happening in my brain also starts to happen in your brain and vice versa. And that's known as neural synchronization or neural entrainment. And the thing is that because of how we've evolved, when that happens, it feels wonderful. We crave that. And it's kind of interesting to understand why. So if you go back eons ago, the thing that set the Homo sapiens apart from other species was our ability to communicate. And so people who are really good at communication tended to succeed. They tended to live longer, to have more children. And so we evolved, our brains literally evolved to become good at communication. Communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. It is the thing that has allowed our species to succeed so well in the animal kingdom. And now the question is, like, how does your brain encourage you to communicate? How does it encourage you? Well, it gives you a reward sensation when you connect with someone. The reason why you feel so good after you have a great conversation is because literally your brain is releasing neurotransmitters to make you feel good.
It's true.
And so it sort of changes our idea of what a conversation ought to be. The goal of a conversation is to achieve that neural entrainment. We understand each other better when our brains look more and more similar. And that's why these three kinds of conversations are so important, is because if I'm having an emotional conversation and you're having a practical conversation, we're actually using different parts of our brain. So it's very hard for us to become entrained. It's very hard for us to become synchronized. unless you say, okay, I'm going to lean into the emotional because Charles is feeling emotional. And then I'm going to introduce the practical and Charles is going to join me in the practical. Then we're using the same parts of our brains at the same time. And that entrainment is so much easier to achieve.
You mentioned something that I've always been interested in and have sort of championed this idea that your communication skills really are either a lid or, an improvement to your leadership skills. In other words, the better communicators tend to be better leaders. And that's true whether you ever put a microphone on or not. But if you think about the person who can get her ideas across in a meeting, if you think about the person who communicate clearly and effectively with a coworker, is it actually a superpower in communication that actually
absolutely
elevates all of your leadership?
100%. And study after study has shown this. But when you start your career, oftentimes the key to success is technical skills, right? Do I know how to build this thing? Do I know the basics of preaching? Do I know how to lead a conference? But almost, within 5 years, the differentiator between people who stay at that beginning level and the people who become experts and who rise through the ranks is communication. It's 100% communication. And I'll mention one thing because you mentioned communication as an important skill. And oftentimes when we do, we talk about speaking. We talk about, for instance, the person who can get their idea across, the person who can explain themselves clearly. And that is an important part of communication. But there's an equally important part of communication. That person who asks the right question, that person who in a meeting invites others to speak and makes them feel welcome to speak, the person who can listen really, really well, that is also the great communicator. And so it's not enough to just be the person who can explain yourself. You have to be the person who can not only listen, but help other people to hear. That becomes a critical skill as well.
You tell so many great and compelling, memorable stories in the book. And I'd love for you, whether it's a particular story or whether you want to just give the patterns, to sort of go through the supercommunicators that you study, exactly what you say, not just people who are orators who can get their ideas across, but they listen, they pick up, they move to an emotional level, they ask the deeper questions, they listen, they reciprocate, there is that synchronicity. And I think everybody listening has had those conversations before. And you exactly what you said, you get that hit in your brain of satisfaction that says, wow, that was I call it life-giving conversation.
Yeah.
What are the elements or ingredients in those conversations?
So there's a couple of stories that I love. One of them is about the CIA officer who's trying to recruit this overseas agent and is just miserable at it. He's like the worst CIA officer on the face of the planet. And one of the things he realizes, he goes to dinner with this woman that he's trying to recruit, and she's really, really glum. She's about to go home. They're both in Europe, and she's from the Middle East. She's about to go home, and she's really disappointed in herself because she came to Europe hoping she'd discover something about how to be more authentic in the world. And during dinner, he keeps trying to cheer her up. He tells her funny stories. He reminisces about when they've been sightseeing together. And it just doesn't work, right? And at some point, he just sort of gives up, and he says, look, I'm not going to be able to recruit this woman. She told me no already, and nothing's working. And so he kind of just becomes honest, and he's kind of feeling glum too, because he's saying I'm actually about to get fired from the CIA. I am so bad at this job. I thought I was good at it, and it turns out this is all I've ever wanted to do in my entire life, and I'm terrible at this job. And it's only once he starts matching her. So he listens to what she's saying. Instead of ignoring what she's saying, he starts listening to what she's saying, that she's feeling glum. And he starts proving to her that he is listening by saying, what I hear you say is that you are feeling down. And instead of just trying to make you feel better, I'm going to take seriously what you're saying to me. That's when she can hear him for the first time. And she ultimately ends up agreeing to become a CIA asset and one of the best resources in the Middle East over the next 20 years. So the tactics that supercommunicators have is that they ask more questions. They ask 10 to 20 times more questions than the average person.
10 to 20x.
Yeah. And a good number of those are deep questions. And that doesn't mean that they're probing or intrusive. That doesn't mean they're saying, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? It means they're saying, Carey, how'd you decide to become a podcast host? Or someone says, where do you live? I live in the Heights. Oh, what do you love about the Heights? Why'd you decide to move there? They're asking people how they feel about their lives instead of just the facts of their lives. That's number one. Number two is that they reciprocate. They reciprocate authenticity. They reciprocate vulnerability. That does not mean that if you tell me that your aunt passed away, I have to tell you about a story about when one of my relatives passed away. But it does mean that I should say something like, I'm really sorry, I know how hard that is. What was your aunt like? Like, tell me a little bit about her. Because what I'm doing in that case is I'm reciprocating the vulnerability that you're showing me. So it's really important to do that reciprocation, to share of ourselves, even if that means just asking another question, to share of ourselves when someone has shared with us. And then the final thing is just to show the person that you want to connect. This is ultimately what supercommunicators do. This is why looping for understanding is so powerful. This is why asking deep questions is so powerful, is because there's the subtext there. And the subtext is, I want to connect with you. And think about how frequently we're in conversations and we don't say that to the other person and they don't say it to us, right? We don't take a second to say look, I actually want to connect with you. I think that you're special. When we do that, it feels wonderful, but it's something that we don't often do automatically. And what supercommunicators do is they show you that they want to connect with you. And that's the first and most important step in making that connection.
I think one of the journeys I've had in my life is to talk less and listen more. And It's been hard. I'm a natural talker. So, when I read Supercommunicators, I kind of came across that idea that maybe even more so, I should do some more listening. Can you give us some examples of how to listen, how to reciprocate, so that we have a few things we can start trying out tomorrow?
So I think the number one thing is listening is not a passive activity. When we think about listening, we often think about sitting back and just listening. But listening should be active. It should be something where I'm asking you questions, where I am saying, oh, you mentioned this thing and that really resonates with me because something similar happened to me. Does it seem to you like these are similar? Did I learned this thing? Did you learn something similar? And I think the thing is that if we set a goal for ourselves, which is, I'm meeting someone new and I want to get to their hopes and dreams within 3 questions. Or I'm having a conversation with an old friend and I want to find out, I know that their dad passed away 2 years ago. I want to find out, how did that change them? When we set that goal for ourselves, what we're really doing is we're setting a goal to say, I want to understand this person better. And then asking the questions and listening becomes actually very automatic, right? Because instead of going into that conversation and saying, I want to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, I want to impress you, I want you to think I'm smart, what I'm going is, and I'm saying, I want to learn something about you that I don't know. That all of us know that the fastest way to achieve that goal is to ask questions and to listen. And so it becomes much more authentic and automatic.
One of the things, and just as we wrap up today, Charles, that, this podcast has been going almost 10 years. And episode 5, I was listening to it with my wife and I said, hey, hon, any feedback? And she's like, yeah, you talk too much. I'm like, oh, owned. You're right. So I've been trying to do a better and better job of listening and being quiet and let the guest carry it. But I get a lot of questions on my question asking. And you'll notice we've touched on a few of the questions I sent you and a lot that we haven't. And I said, probably my biggest hack a decade in is follow the curiosity trail. I can have a measured conversation where I'm like, question 15, Charles, and I can do that. Or I can just listen.
The worst.
Yeah, it is the worst. In chapter 4, you say. In chapter 5, follow the curiosity trail. So when you say things, it makes me curious. I either want to know more, I don't understand, and I want to go deeper, or I'm like, well, what's underneath that? Can you say anything about curiosity in conversations that could help me or listeners get better at that?
And I think that's a great instinct. I think you found the thing that matters the most, which is, and by the way, I don't think you talk too much at all. I think you ask great questions.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm working on it.
I think that oftentimes it's important to listen to ourselves, right? To have conversations with ourselves. When we're present in a conversation, the reason why it doesn't sound polished, the reason why the transcript looks so messy is because I'm in the middle of the conversation. I'm experiencing the conversation. I'm enjoying it. And part of that is listening to myself. And when you say something interesting and the conversation has moved on a little bit, going back and saying, you mentioned this thing that was sort of fascinating. Can I ask you more about that? Like tell me what happened. When we listen to ourselves and we're in the practice of having conversations with ourselves, that's when we know what to do next. As I mentioned, our brains have evolved to be fantastic at communication. All of us are natural supercommunicators. Sometimes we get in our own way. Sometimes life pushes us in our own way, right? Sometimes life, I apologize.
Go ahead.
Sometimes it's really, really easy to get distracted, as I just was. And sometimes it's really, really easy for, life to say, look, you've got 13 things you got to think about in the next 10 minutes. But the more that we spend time practicing listening to ourselves, the more that we spend time practicing listening to other people, that's when we let those instincts that have been honed by millions and millions of years, that's when we let those instincts out. And that's when we have wonderful conversations.
Well, I'll tell you, your research is a breath of fresh air, as is the book. And I'm looking forward to improving my communication skills every year. So thank you for contributing to the field. Charles, the book is called Supercommunicators. It's available everywhere. Where are people able to track with you online these days?
I would love to hear from folks. So my email is charles@charlesduhigg.com. If you send me an email, I will read it and reply. I can promise. Yeah, I think there's like 32,000 that we've replied to. So I promise you'll get a reply. But equally, if you just Google me or you Google the power of habit or you Google Supercommunicators, I'll come up, and I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and all the normal places. But I would love to hear from folks.
Well, keep curious, stay curious, keep writing, keep researching. And thank you so much for sharing. And I really appreciate you, what you didn't cover in the book, but applying the principles to stage communication. Man, that is a gift. I gotta tell you, it's made me rethink my next talk. So really grateful for this conversation. I will let you know. I'll send you a note.
Please
Charles,
do.
thank you.
Thank you, Carey. Take care.